Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds. So, welcome back to another episode of Land of the Giants with myself and with Daniel. Over to Daniel.
Hey, well, I guess today is going to be Introduction to Plato because we were just talking about that, and there are three works that we think are the most important works of Plato that we would want to each discuss individually in an idealized version of the future of this show. But today we're just going to talk about what they are and briefly go over them. And maybe one day we will be able to reread each of them and go into more detail.
And I would also add to any of our viewers who have watched this before, anybody new, if you would particularly like to see a Plato episode, definitely send a message to myself or Daniel through Twitter. We will respond. And I would even go so far as to say, if you have any particular suggestions of works that you would like us to consider discussing, feel free to share.
Oh
So,
yes, please do. Because we love talking about these things.
indeed, and we will obviously reserve the right to decide whether or not they represent one of the treacherous works that should be in a canon or one of those things that has hacked its way in. But we're happy to consider anything.
Okay. Oh, speaking of treacherous, I think Plato is the most treacherous author in the whole Western tradition. And
I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to say Nietzsche's second, but only because of his immersion in Plato.
sure. So the three works are, and the reason Plato is the most treacherous is that there are different versions of Plato throughout his works. So that's why these three different works are important. So the first of these is the Apology, which is the story of Socrates defending himself against charges of uh, corrupting the youth, and his defense uh, was ineffective with the elders of Athens, but it was very effective with Plato, apparently, because Plato turned it into a work that has long survived Socrates himself. And we like the Apology because it is about an independent person.
And I would say I particularly like the Apology because I think on a spectrum of Plato personae, it stands at one extreme, and I think we can see in there the part of Plato, the man, also part of Plato, the intellect that was fighting against or stood in opposition to the Plato of the Republic, which represents the other extreme of the versions of Plato personae. And there we can see Plato functioning very much as precisely one of the patrician elite class that the Apology has presented as those who are condemning Socrates. So even within that framework, we can see if we were going to psychoanalyze Plato or if we were going to take a intellectual history development perspective, either one, you can see that the mind itself of Plato contained both those seeds. And when they were taken to their kind of purified forms, you get this framework in which our third work kind of sits somewhere in the middle. And
that is the Symposium, which is certainly the most fun, the most enjoyable work of Plato, I think. And it is kind of a work, it is a story about people talking at a party, and each person talks about different things. And it is not entirely clear what the overall theme of the Symposium is, or what Plato's agenda is in writing it. But there are certainly um, uh, intriguing connections between the stories that make you think he is saying something important.
I think maybe
And
one, I think you're right. I mean, I just was listening to you thinking that I don't know if I've ever come across anything that suggests that the symposium is very postmodern, but I think it is. I think it is um, really successful because you're not certain, you can't say with any certainty what the authorial perspective is. It is successful as a piece of literature in as much as the viewpoint moves sufficiently enough that you are somewhat destabilized by it, in as much as just as if you were listening to that conversation, your own impressions are being swayed throughout the text and you're not being taken on any kind of linear driving direction to a conclusion.
but I can't remember enough about it to say anything more. So I would have to reread it to tell you what the intriguing connections are. But
Likewise.
I do remember quite a bit about the Republic. So I'm going to go back to that. So to me, like when I first read Plato, it the book I had started with the Euthyphro, which is a really great, very short work, and then it went on to the Apology, and I thought that that was just fantastic, and I really liked the Symposium when I got to that, but when I got to the Republic, I thought it was just the most incredibly boring thing that I could imagine. And I could not see what people liked about it or why it's considered to be an important book at all. And and I felt like when I went to college, all the professors thought it was an important book, the philosophy professors. And actually, I remember taking a philosophy course where the professor said Socrates is actually not a very important philosopher. It's really Plato who is the real important philosopher here, which I thought was was not my impression. You know, to me, like when Plato is just talking about in what seems like his voice as opposed to something that seems more like the Socrates from the Apology. I just I don't like him at all. And
Yeah. And, no, I mean, I think that's a really, I was listening to you and I was thinking about how, much like how there is some kind of signaling of alignment when a person chooses to say Bitcoin as opposed to blockchain, or chooses to say Bitcoin instead of Bitcoin, and capital B, the whole network rather than the asset. I think there is something to be said also in terms of how people intellectually align with Plato of the Republic, Plato of the Plato, as opposed to Plato of the Socrates. And it's interesting to kind of speculate whether or not it just remains the case that a lot of the Socrates Plato voice or suggestion or whatever implications, however you want to construe it, it's still challenging and problematic and destabilizing. Whereas the Plato of the Republic, I think, I sort of agree with you. I think there are these, I mean, we were talking about Hobbes, right? As kind of this thing that starts every bibliography. No, it's the one you got to read it. And it's not even clear necessarily what its value is.
right.
To a certain extent, it takes its value from being perhaps sort of, let's say, the Republic is sort of the first evidence, right? Right. We don't know if it was the first ever, but it's definitely survived as evidence of a fully imagined out political system that is theoretical. It's not Herodotus running around going, "Look what I found." People, running their societies like this or like that. And so, as an example of sort of theoretical political engineering science, I think that's why it's continued to have resonance. Just the very fact of being able to imagine a utopia, dystopia, 5-year plan, Congress, to-do list. I mean, whatever version it is of social engineering, political engineering as a project that people can engage in, is, I think, one of the reasons why it's still, revered.
Oh, well, okay. Well, anyway, I think that the Republic deserves to be treated as a cult leader book because I don't feel like I understood the Republic until I understood Scientology and other religions. And one thing that I know about myself is that I value my autonomy a lot. Okay, so if somebody is telling me something that is not engaging me, is not engaging in that need for me, then I just find it boring, and that's why the Republic is boring to me
Yes,
because
I wouldn't argue that it's exciting. I would only argue that it's important, not that it's
oh
good.
my God, and it is a cult leader book that happened to get important in the Western tradition, and so the cave metaphor. I want to talk about that because every cult leader will give you a version of the cave metaphor. And what Plato says is that you are trapped in a cave and you have never seen the real reality. And he says, I Plato, will show you the outside of the cave. I know the real reality, so I'm going to lead you out. And um, it's a dumb trick, but it works. They all do this.
So, I mean, I will say that in response to that, like my one of the things that, having kind of gone formally through, the Western canon, I definitely find that the further away authors get from the Republic, the more likely they are to kind of perhaps intellectually know, but kind of entirely discount that the Athenian version of democracy, that this wonderful modern state and so on, was one that was entirely functioning off of the backside of slavery, right? And that the number of people who could participate in democracy was minimal, and that you're really talking about the broadening of participation by taking your oligarchy from this size to this size. So some of the things that happen with regards to the Republic in particular are that it's sort of fascist implications are overlooked. And so for me, 1984 was the book that I read that really allowed me to, with a modern mindset, penetrate what I thought was important to know about the Republic. Because if a text or a reference is being used by those in authority to justify their authority, you really do need to know about the text in order to destabilize it, right? So that's always my justification for advocating that uh, people know about stuff, because effectively liberation of mind is about being able to determine which bits are coming in with whose agenda, so as to just even create a space for you to have your own thoughts. And then in terms of the cave, yeah, the cave remains, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most potent metaphors in the Western canon. And as I've shared with you in private, I don't think Plato came up with that all by himself. I think that is like one of those, kind of ancient archetypal insights, much like the cost of acquiring wisdom or knowledge, the story of Eden, the tree of knowledge, all those kinds of things. So this idea about truth being beyond a certain set of senses, and that one can access real truth with a capital T through some mechanism, which, as you pointed out, is exactly the premise for any kind of cult leader to come in and say, I know the way. I know the way. I will show you the way. Follow me.
Okay, well, wait. I wanna respond to all the stuff you said now. So first of all, slave society. Yeah, you cannot have slaves without cult leader style mind control. Okay, that is a necessary part of the equation, and that's why Sauron in Lord of the Rings is like a manipulative mind control, giant eye, like cult leader kind of thing.
Mhm.
It's and that is and it is worthwhile to read cult leader books, but you need to have. I think that you need to. Well, I would just like people to look at the books the way I do, where I kind of am aware of who whether the book is trying to mind control me.
Yeah, a
See,
little bit like
because
a warning label, right? Like a little bit like in the 90s, sort of, oh my God, Tipper Gore and her, it has sex and violence. They should come with warning labels that says this is trying to convert you to something, or this will, blow your mind. So
oh, wait. I still have one more thing. I want to recommend another video, and I'm going to give you the link, and it's called The Matrix, Scientology, and Disconnection. So this video is done by a former Scientologist that I like called Aaron Smith Levin, and he talks about the movie The Matrix, and
yeah.
he says that being in Scientology is like being one of the main characters in the movie The Matrix. Okay. Now, The Matrix, the movie, if you watch the movie, what you think is happening is that the main character is leaving a society of cult-like mind control because he's kind of in corporate America, and then he learns that there are these futuristic machines that are secretly controlling everybody. Okay. So what Aaron Smith Levin says is that is kind of what Scientology is telling you, is that there are all of these science fictiony unseen forces that are causing the problems that you have in your real life, and most people can't see them. And so you should think of the movie The Matrix as being like entering a cult, not like leaving a cult. Okay.
Hmm.
And The Matrix is that's Plato's cave right
100%.
there.
I mean, I wanted to jump in and say, like, anybody who's ever read anybody who even knows, right? The Matrix, I think one of its impacts precisely was that it was laying out some version of the Plato cave metaphor, and I think that if we think about the ways in which even speculation, for example, that the universe is a quantum computer game being played by someone else outside of it, you know, I mean, you can get what's so interesting to me, and I said it to you before, is that you know, as much as the cave metaphor can be read as one in which it's suggesting that there's a reality not available to our senses, and that has been used as a justification for religious regimes as well as sort of philosophical regimes like absolute truth and absolute justice and all the rest of it. There's also a perspective that goes, what's being described there is some version of a kind of an insight into the quantum nature of the universe, where, okay, so you're in a cave and you're looking at a shadow which is a copy of a truth, but if you then change your perspective as an observer, you then get an access to another different truth. So I've read people who have taken some of the kind of theoretical physics speculations about the implications of multiple holographs of the universe, and worked it happily into a Platonic cave metaphor.
Oh my God. Okay, look, I'm
Right?
gonna have to stop you there. So maybe one day we will do a video on real physics,
Yeah,
but
that was. Um,
but
and speaking of that, one of the nicest ideas I've heard recently, and again, we should maybe put this out to any viewers who want to ask us to either talk more about Plato, because we are supposed to be talking about Kafka, or maybe talk about Newton and possibly Adam Smith, because one of the things that I've been sort of reflecting on recently is the way in which so much of classical and modern capital M, modern economic writing, thinking, is very Newtonian in
Oh
its
my
sort of
God.
metaphors.
And of course, yeah, physicists are way past Newtonian physics.
Right, and the
But
question,
no,
but the interesting question is whether or not things like behavioral economics, right, or a recent awareness of, thank you, Donald Rumsey and Taleb, but these factors that we don't know, and so on, whether or not some of the shifts in our ways of modeling economics, which is the reflection of human stuff, is actually reflecting kind of more quantum physics than classical physics.
okay, well, let me give you my answer there, because I think that there is a connection, but I think that the connection is simply our lack of knowledge of the details. And I don't think that there is some kind of, magical fundamental connection there. I think that basically the way that we think about particle physics experiments when we do quantum mechanics, it is much of the approach is simply based on the idea that there there is limited understanding of what is happening behind the scenes, and it is possible for mundane things to cause effects that are similar to quantum mechanics. Uh, so I would agree that there's a connection, but the connection is simply the way of thinking about things that are where the fundamental process is unknown to you.
I think that itself is the the engine, the power of what happens when whatever kind of non-linguistic based forms of understanding that we as human beings are operating with about how the world separate from us works, the way that those understandings work their way into the language that we then use to describe people in whatever form that is, in their economic behavior, their emotional behavior, their biological behavior, right? There is a profound nexus, so that when there are significant shifts in the ways in which we non-linguistically understand the world, they will show up in our language, which itself will reshape our concepts. So whatever one's perspective on Einstein as a physicist, in particular in the domain of physics, there's no question that 100 years later, the language, the concept, the reality, the possibility that the actual world outside of us can be described in relativistic terms shows up in the ways in which we think about how we can describe anything else in our world. So how people behave, how morals function. It's the basis for one of my favorite words, but it is the basis for much of postmodern thought. I don't think you could have a general mass understanding of the idea that there is such a thing called fake news without tracing back to this monster cluster of like Freud, Einstein, and Nietzsche all within one bang, and you've got roots of something that's very different from a classical physics perspective, and much of a kind of market as a machine metaphor of 16th, 17th, 18th century thinking. So I mean that's just one of, and I'm not making an observation about one is right or better or wrong or worse. I'm simply saying it's kind of interesting to note that we are super confined by our language. And I'm being interrupted by my dog.
Okay, well, let's go back to the Republic now. But yes, I would like to do an episode on Einstein, on what what his ideas really are versus what people think about him.
Yeah, and
And
which posters they put up on their walls in their college dorms or their offices or their fridge magnets, right?
yes,
Behind the scenes.
so so you shouldn't other people tell you that they have a special connection to reality, because that is a very easy trick. In fact, you should go and try doing that yourself. And I think that is okay, as long as you don't actually take advantage of somebody once you find out that it totally works. Uh, so
Yeah, well,
just go around.
but that's where having a non-zero sum approach, where having a collective approach, where having a do good unto other people approach, where being basically a nice person, remembering that it's good to be nice better than to be nasty, kicks in, right? So whether or not we put that under a fancy term of ethics or morals or whatever we want to call it, um, ultimately the experience of being subject to someone else's power resides in the nature of the personality of who is exercising the power. I mean, I think that's the thing that's always so problematic about systems like the Republic or the Utopia or the American Constitution or any of the projects in constructing an entity. You can do your best to sort of, I don't know, mitigate or neutralize the randomness of character, but you can't eradicate um, the kind of random effect that a person's given character is going to have on their exercising of whatever power or advantage that they hold is.
Sure. And well, now why don't we talk a little bit about what the idea of the society in the Republic actually is? Because Plato doesn't bother to do what you're talking about very much. He
Yeah.
he he wants, or I should say, he wants a society that I guess will select the people who have the good character, and then they will simply have absolute power in it once they are appointed to the the top class. So he imagines a society with three classes. There are the working class, and the military class, and the philosopher king class. And then I guess you should also say there's the children class, because when people are children, they have not been put in a class yet, um, and it is determined where they're going to go as they are growing up.
Yes, the whole kind of foreshadowing of the kind of eugenics program or the kind of ant-like colony program is clear, for sure.
It sounds just like something out of science fiction, doesn't it? Like you just see stuff like
It
this.
does, and we're like incrementally moving closer to, like, Brave New World, and but I think the thing there that's interesting is that, of course, Plato had knowledge of Sparta, which did in fact have a very successful militaristic kind of communal based social organization, and some of that kind of actual pooling of children and non-raising of children by their biological individual parents and so on, and then selection amongst the group for it's Borg-like as well, right? I mean, the resistance is futile,
Oh,
right?
the
There is
Spartans are totally just like the Borg.
totally. So, I mean, I think we can see, excuse my language, but we can see Plato and all of the Athenians having a hard on for Sparta, right? I mean, there's no question that that society was held as a counterpoint in their own mind to some of their own either weaknesses or things that they could maybe do
Free
better.
thinking, who cares about that?
Oh my God, free thinking is and always has been a luxury of those that have the time to think.
Yeah.
So, that's also one thing to point out. Um, it it is the case that
And
we have to be careful about these things that we take as rights and not understand that they are luxuries, and that if we don't extend sufficient luxury to sufficient people, we really don't get any kind of aggregate exercising of the right. But that's a
oh
whole
my God.
other.
Well, that is a subject for another episode, I think.
Yeah.
But
And
but Sparta had an even more extensive slave society than Athens did.
right.
And if you were an upper class Spartan, you were supposed to regularly terrorize the Helot class. And this is something that I remember learning about in history, but you know, in my history class, I was not um I, I was not explained how you also need ideological mind control to keep slaves. That's really never something that uh, has
But
been
that's what
conveyed appropriately to me, I would
right.
say, in my
But I think
education.
right. But I think that one of the really successful things that the Matrix does is lay out precisely a kind of concept in which you the using of the human body as a battery for a whole other civilization. The idea of the human being as some kind of economic unit, right? That the participation in what we consider to be the sort of dignity of being just simply that's accorded to you simply by being human is clearly not present within ancient societies and still clearly not present within many modern societies. So it remains, I think, the capacity to even critique uh, slave societies, right? And it's important that people recognize that there are multiple forms and flavors and feelings of slavery, and not everything is straight out of roots. You have to be willing to engage in many, many, many sort of more subtle forms of relationship that are slavery. If you start digging around in the ancient world, or you start trying to understand some of the other forms of 18th century slavery throughout the Caribbean, or how the slave trade worked in Europe during the Dark Ages, or how it worked in Africa. And so when we start looking at the ancient world, right, we are looking at relationships that are perhaps somewhat more easily understood, like indentured servitude. We're looking at relationships that are overlaid with all kinds of emotional bond and familiarity, and you would no sooner sell your slave than cut off your arm, but because you were so attached to your slave, right? And and the numbers of situations throughout history where people who have been enslaved and have been offered their freedom choose not to embrace their freedom. So that's true in Greek literature. It was true in Bermuda in the 17th century. There was a ship of Bermudian slaves that ended up in New York, and they said, "No, thank you. We want to go home." So it's a complex thing, but it definitively has the idea of the natural order, or there being an unquestioning benefit to the group of having these very strictly defined layers of function and capacity, right? And I think perhaps one of the things that has made the Republic so long lasting throughout Western thought is Plato's idea that you can somehow come up with like a Mandarin Test or something. You can come up with something that ensures that only the good and the wise and the excellent.
Oh
Um,
my God, I love the Mandarin Test comparison, because
right,
like the test of the Mandarins was simply understanding Chinese culture. So you would have to understand poetry and write poetry, and you would have to use rhetoric basically,
right,
and that was the test.
right. Which is effectively what Plato is saying in the context of his times, in as much as if he's casting about looking at what kind of class of people could he theoretically derive his philosopher kings from, he's looking at his own peer group, all of whom had enough time and leisure to be literate, literary, knowledgeable, and that those things were absolutely the capacity to even be philosophical is a function of already being in a particular group of people who have access to a particular set of resources. So while it looks on the surface like you just need to go and master some books, um, there's coded within that all kinds of things about you have to be able to have the time and resources to be literate in the first place and then learn them. It's not that different, whatever, 2 millennia, 3 millennia later. Um, and of course, there are always outliers. I mean, to a certain extent, that's one of the things that was so disturbing about Socrates, was that he wasn't somebody from within the fold. He was somebody who had managed to, and you see this in Chinese history as well, the outlier personality that somehow manages to.
Okay, wait. I want to. I'm just reading the book of Chuang Tzu, That's probably not the correct pronunciation at all, but here's something right from the introduction that is a story about this semi-legendary figure. Someone offered Chuang Tzu a court post. Chuang Tzu answered the messenger, "Sir, have you ever seen a sacrificial ox? It is decked in fine garments and fed on fresh grass and beans. However, when it is led into the great temple, even though it most earnestly might wish to be a simple calf again, it's now impossible." So there's Socrates for you right there. Except you can argue that Socrates knew that he would not be exonerated by the group, and that he was really demonstrating that they are irrational for everybody to see
Yeah,
by his testimony.
you're speaking, you're reading out loud there, and it made me associate. I don't think I've ever made this direct association, but there's something not dissimilar in the sacrifice of Socrates for the greater good, kind of, I died on your behalf for your sins kind of thing, right? Socrates as Christ as a kind of Socrates, um, I don't know, avatar type of thing. That's one of the things that strikes me, right? And as the story kind of moves forward in time, the idea that a society wrongly killed a voice or a truth or a something they needed to know and learn within their society that has outlasted those that kind of killed it.
Oh my God. Okay, so that totally ties right into the idea that I wanted to conclude this episode with, and that is anti-fragility.
Yay.
And so if you are somebody where who can have a mistake like not listening to someone who is making logical arguments when he is on trial, and if or well, I don't think that the Jesus story really happened, but if you are vulnerable to somebody making up a story like that,
Well, I
then
mean, most of our most powerful stories, right, are some version of something happened at some time, and
yeah,
people have created a narrative meaning structure. So you know, it exists, whether it
right.
happened, it exists.
Then you are fragile. And
Mm.
if you are a government Mandarin official, you are fragile because you can be the sacrificial ox at any time. And Plato doesn't mention this in the Republic. He says, the philosopher kings are going to rule everybody. But in order to convince people that you are you deserve to have that kind of control over them, you have to be willing to have a scapegoat every once in a while.
Right. You have to have a bad
And
apple.
that's what makes you fragile, because if you decide to be the scapegoat, you can turn that against them. See, so there are all these kind of tricks you can do. See, so
and or the way that you're perceived, right, by the people that you are controlling. I mean, you're one of the nicest things for me about the anti-fragile kind of framework, right, is that it makes Italy and Italian politics and culture from now going all the way back a poster child, because it is a system that is chaotic and unclear and kind of to the contrary to the wise philosopher kings. There's a working assumption that everybody in parliament is a crook, a porn star, a mafioso, like your brother's sister's cousin. And so if you have built into a system a presumption of chaos, then its capacity to react to chaos is actually much greater than one that is structured so as to only be able to cope with a scenario in which any kind of challenge to itself from within itself is one bad apple that then has to be, taken out, turned into a scapegoat. And the whole premise of your Mandarin test or your mechanism for ensuring that your philosopher king people are the best, the brightest, the most ethical, the blah, 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 right? Right?
Okay, well, now let's relate that back to Bitcoins because it's so close now. I might as well just say it. So,
Might as
like,
well.
so so I think that in Bitcoin there's a culture where people think that you have to pass some kind of Mandarin test in order to have your opinion heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is kind of a reason why Roger Ver kind of got drummed out and decided to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the reason why I decided to turn into a troll character,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I don't need to pass the Mandarin test, and I know how to screw with people a little bit who think that there does need to be a Mandarin test.
And I,
So
and I will say on my own part, right, my perspective as a Bitcoin anthropologist, right, is to point out that there is a plethora growing all the time of types of Mandarin test. So depending on which kind of sub-tribe you belong to, starting with the big macro ones and then getting further down in there, they are all developing their versions of Mandarin tests.
oh
Um,
my God, okay, we have to
really,
do
really,
that. That
like
is awesome.
if you take either the kind of like more
This is so
traditional,
awesome. You need to write a paper on this
I
and
well,
say
I'm
like
on a mission.
group A, what is the Mandarin test for this group?
Right, precisely, precisely.
Oh
And
my, you have to do that.
well, if anyone out there is listening and is interested in funding, a pretty major research project, documentary, snapshot, because if you take macro tribes to either be geographical, right, just start there, language, geography. I mean, what's going on in Egypt, right? Egypt says cryptocurrency is terrible, wrong, all bad against Islam, terrible, terrible, nobody can do it. And they've just been busted, mining cryptocurrency through all of their nationals' phones, right? So I mean, the variation of just geography. Then you could take macro tribes, which are about kind of legitimate sectors, right? The macro tribes of the miners, macro tribes of the developers, users, exchanges, but then there's also, I think, one of the most interesting ones, which I think spreads across those boundaries, so globally and kind of sector wise, are you a Bitcoin capital B? Are you a blockchain, big B, small b, or are you a crypto? And which word you first will first kind of jump out of your mouth in terms of fill in the blank, space, sphere, whatever, gives you an idea of what, and all of those various groups, I reckon, share some foundational myths, some core kind of sanctified texts, starting with Satoshi's white paper, and have, as I say, like developing Mandarin tests, and it's really like the development of multiple kind of, I don't know, Tower of Babel kind of language forms. So I could go on and on about this, and I
Okay,
definitely.
well, if you heard that, there's your pitch for an important research project. Uh,
The emperor and the
and let me just conclude by saying I hope that there will be a another important tribe soon that whose Mandarin test is can you play a funny character? That's the tribe that I'm starting. Or I they're all, I don't want to say I'm starting it because I know there are other people already kind of doing
Well,
something similar,
you
but
could be aggregating. You could be aggregating,
we
right?
are yes, we are aggregating, right?
We are
That's the
aggregating. I will aggregate with you as Bitcoin anthropologist to your Bitcoin emperor.
and
Yeah, for sure.
the people who can play a funny character are the anti-fragile people.
Right, right. I think that's correct, and I think that we should talk about this in one of our more kind of investment frames, but it does go back to this part about being able to be both indifferent and skeptical when you when one operates as an investor, because I think that sort of cultivating a funny, flexible, sort of willing to be subversive character as a lens through which to kind of interact with all of this allows precisely a kind of much easier capacity for skepticism and indifference, which I suppose is the cousin, the flip side, whatever it is. But I think they do go hand in hand.
Yeah,
You get
that's yeah, Pyrrhonian skepticism.
yes.
Yeah, that's what I've been calling indifference. And
Yeah.
you well, anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean,
I don't have anything else. So
right. On that
so
note, you could also reach the Buddhists, right, and just say that indifference is another way of saying non-excessive attachment, so as to blind yourself to new information.
oh yeah. Okay, well, great episode.
Great episode. I will definitely retitle this one, and we will come back shortly with Kafka's trial. And thank you for watching. And any suggestions, as we said, we're more than open to them. See you in the next one.